I'm very glad that so many of you have made it here into the 4th district. And since you have completed this long journey from the International Center, and since many of you might not be that familiar with Vienna, might not be familiar with this institution, let me tell you a few things about us. Our main job here is to prepare talented young women and men for an international career. We are a professional school offering 2 different 2-year master's programs and a year-long diploma program. What all of these programs have in common is that we teach them in a distinctly interdisciplinary manner, instructing our highly international student body in economics, law, history, and political science. We also place a strong emphasis on the command of languages. Now, guess where international organizations in general and the UN in particular feature on career wish lists of our student body? Many of them obviously put them on the very top. And it always gives me great pleasure when I go over to the International Center and I usually see quite a few of our former students who have made it then across the Danube River. It also tells us, I think, something about the young generation, that it believes in international organizations and believes in global governance, which I think should give us a lot of hope for the future. Now, a successful professional school cannot work without research, and it most definitely cannot work without events like this. So we are, amongst other things, also a forum on international affairs. And this very room, for this reason, is booked out for most of the year. Having said that, this ACONS conference is of special importance to us. It is dedicated to linking UN agencies with academia and civil society. In other words, it is an effort to contribute to global governance. Global governance is not old-style diplomacy. It is not secretive, and it is not confined to state interaction. Instead, it is about a network of different actors and the communication that links them together. UN agencies, academic institutions, and civil society occupy crucial nodes in this network. At this point, let me use this opportunity and thank the organizers of this conference for the excellent job they have done and that they are doing, and especially Michael Platzer for putting all of this together. It's a lot of work, but it really is a fantastic conference that we put together there every year. Thanks a lot. Global governance produces outcomes of the highest salience for global politics, no matter whether that is in the field of security, economics, environment, health, migration, and so on. Today's talk is about such an outcome, UN peacekeeping. From its beginnings as an interposition force, UN peacekeeping has developed into a much more multifaceted and flexible instrument. It was during the cooperative 10 years or so before and after the end of the Cold War that the peacekeeping concept was fundamentally revisited. No longer is there only a military component, but there are strong civilian and police components as well. Peacekeeping, the often quoted Chapter 6.5 measure, clearly has matured. But this does not mean that the evolution of this crucial instrument has stopped. Peacekeeping, as any instrument of conflict prevention, management, transformation, resolution, has to adapt to changing times. This leads me to tonight's talk, which is entitled The Future of UN Peacekeeping. And let me extend a very cordial welcome to Abiodun Williams, who's going to give this talk today. Let me also stop at this point and give Michael the floor here, because he's going to introduce our speaker, and he's also going to introduce our discussant.
Thank the Diplomatic Academy for giving us these facilities, and also the close cooperation with our friends from the Defense Studies Academy to finally launch this event. For those who don't know about it, there's a conference going on at the United Nations for the next 2 days, and those who still want to go should contact Maria Idomar, a graduate of the Diplomatic Academy. Please stand. Okay, you may have some more problems, but there are people who might want to come over tomorrow. The discussions were very interesting today, and tomorrow will be even more interesting. On Friday, students will be presenting their thoughts on what the UN should be doing. We will have a special award, an ACONS award for the best student presentations. So we look forward to having you come over tomorrow, and also there are still tickets to the mayor's reception tomorrow evening at the Rathaus, all the alcohol you can drink. Okay. But I'm very, very lucky to have gotten Dr. Williams to come. He is a friend. We were colleagues in the United Nations. He's now Vice President of the U.S. Institute of Peace, and he concentrates on conflict zones such as Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, the Middle East, and North Africa. He was Kofi Annan's close advisor on responsibility to protect, but also on issues of strategic reform in the UN, as well as peace building and international migration. And he served in peacekeeping operations in Bosnia and Herzegovina and Haiti and Macedonia. But he was an academic first, so you can switch to back and forth. He's got an BA, MA honors from Edinburgh. I'm looking at my wife, who's also a graduate of Edinburgh. That's right. She was very impressed with that. And a PhD from Fletcher School of Diplomacy. And he's published widely on conflict prevention, peacekeeping, multilateral negotiations, and publications that are 2 pages long, so I won't read them all. He started off as a little boy in Sierra Leone, right, with Kamdi Yumkela, so it's a long story with maybe a happy ending. Brigadier General Feichtinger is also a unique person because he's an academic, has a PhD from Vienna University, and has risen to one of the highest ranks in the Austrian military. He's a founding member of the International Society of Military Sciences and a regular contributor to the Austrian Military Journal. He has numerous publications on the former Yugoslavia, Afghanistan again, Iraq, Austrian security policy, and he's frequently on television. Many people have seen him, his face on TV. Professor Irene Etzendorfer has been almost everywhere. I think what I saw here, and this is now 5 pages, so I will summarize this very quickly. In Paris, studied taught at Harvard, in Innsbruck, in Klagenfurt, in Romania, I see at Donau University here, and has had many responsible jobs in terms of projects as well as cooperation. So we're very pleased to have her on our panel. Last but not least is my boss, Mr. Jonsson, whose job this was supposed to be, but he said, you do it, so I'm doing it. He's a member of the Royal Swedish Academy. He's a former professor at Emeritus at Lund University, written many, many publications, and has led us ably at the Academic Council on the UN. So I'm going to now leave it to talk for about 40 minutes, and then hopefully there'll be some discussion coming forward. Thank you all.
It gives me great pleasure to be here at the Diplomatic Academy at this event sponsored by the Academic Council on the UN system and the Academy. The Diplomatic Academy has a long tradition of producing graduates who have made significant contributions to the field of diplomacy in general and to the work of the United Nations in particular. And I've had a number of opportunities to work with the graduates of the Diplomatic Academy. Michael mentioned that I began life as an academic, and I recall in felicitous terms the very close relations that existed between the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown, where I was a faculty member, and the Diplomatic Academy, and the regular exchanges we had between faculty and students at the Walsh School of Foreign Service and the faculty and students here at the Diplomatic Academy. So it's very nice to be back. Shakespeare has a way of capturing our dilemmas in a nutshell. In Henry IV, Part 1, he puts into the mouth of Owen Glendower these words: "I can call forth spirits from the vast deep." And Hotspur, who is a very pragmatic man, replies, "Why, so can I, and so can any man, but will they come when you do call for them?" And that, I think, captures the essential challenge you always face in peacekeeping. How do you get the spirits to respond when you call for them? And I'll illustrate this throughout the talk. One of the extraordinary things when one looks at the UN's role in peace and security is the fact that the term peacekeeping cannot be found anywhere in the UN Charter. And it's extraordinary because it's a wonderful example of functional adaptation when the collective security system, which had been set up by the founders of the UN, became paralyzed because of the competition between the superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States. So peacekeeping emerged as a way to fill the vacuum and to end the paralysis. My basic views this evening can be stated simply. First, although peacekeeping was not envisaged by the framers of the UN Charter, it will remain the UN's main operational tool to deal with threats to international peace and security for some time to come. And it will remain, I believe, one of the most demanding and visible aspects of the UN's conflict management work. Second, peacekeeping will remain a key instrument for conflict prevention, post-conflict stabilization, and burden sharing. And third, the United Nations can keep the peace when it is given the right mandate, resources, organizational structure, and consistent political support. And fourth, no other organization, no other regional organization, no other alliance can substitute for the legal and moral authority of the United Nations. In thinking about the future of peacekeeping, I would like to focus on three issues. The first would be the prerequisites for successful peacekeeping operations. Second, to say something about the challenges, quantitative and qualitative, facing UN peacekeeping. And third, to reflect on the important issue of sharing political space in peacekeeping and collective conflict management. Sharing political space between the United Nations and regional organizations in particular. Now, on the first question on the prerequisites of successful peacekeeping operations, there are certain axiomatic prerequisites for successful peacekeeping operations, and these, I believe, will hold true in the future. The first is there must be a peace to keep. Back in the days of the Cold War, the United Nations sent peacekeepers only into places where there was a peace to keep. So impartial observers, civilian or military, lightly armed blue-helmeted troops patrolled buffer zones between hostile parties. They monitored ceasefires and they helped diffuse local conflicts, allowing the search for durable political settlements to continue. Over the past 15, 20 years or so, UN peacekeepers have routinely been sent into areas where there is little or no peace to keep. And that was exactly, of course, what happened in former Yugoslavia and in Bosnia, where peacekeepers were pitchforked into an environment, really into the no man's land between peacekeeping and peace enforcement, with the disastrous results which happened. And the challenge, of course, now is that the UN was designed to stop wars between nations, not within nations. So the early days of peacekeeping were really fairly simple in retrospect, because you're trying to diffuse conflict between hostile parties, usually on a border, and now you have to deal with conflicts within nations. The second axiomatic prerequisite is that there must be a viable political process to support. A peacekeeping operation cannot serve as a substitute for the absence of a political process. What it can do is support a political process to allow warring factions to get together and to find a durable settlement to conflict. And the third axiomatic prerequisite is that a peacekeeping operation should have a clear, a credible, and an achievable mandate. The UN learned this to its cost in the tragedies of the 1990s. If you don't know where you want to go, you will not go anywhere, or you will end up in a place you do not want to be. Again, if we look at the difficulties that UNPROFOR faced in former Yugoslavia, we had over 80 or so Security Council resolutions and presidential statements on UNPROFOR and the situation in former Yugoslavia. That is not the basis for a credible and a clear and achievable mandate in 80 or so resolutions. I think the fourth important factor is that clearly you have to have adequate resources and capabilities to implement the mandate. And there has been a tendency to pile additional tasks onto original mandates by the Security Council, with little or no consideration given to the resource implications of such enlargements. And of course, part of the difficulty is that sometimes the Security Council behaves like a bad doctor, is that if a patient comes and says, well, I'm suffering from an infection, and the patient needs a course of antibiotics, a good doctor always prescribes a course of antibiotics, and you always have the injunction, the medical injunction, make sure you take the entire course of antibiotics, don't stop even if you begin to feel better. But what the Security Council often does is that it prescribes the course of antibiotics, and as soon as the patient begins to show signs of recovery, it moves elsewhere, and the resources go elsewhere. And so you have the continuing problem of relapse in places where peacekeeping operations have been deployed. A good example of this, of course, is Haiti, where Michael mentioned I also served in the late 1990s, where we had a successive of peacekeeping operations in the 90s, and then the UN left, and then the UN was back again, and is back again in Haiti. So you have to have adequate material resources, you have to have the capabilities to implement the mandate. Fifth point, you have to have the cooperation of the parties. It is a sine qua non for success. If you don't have the cooperation of the parties, it is very difficult to succeed. And finally, I would say you need the political will of the Security Council to see the job through, particularly the unified engagement and the support of the P5. Because one thing you can be absolutely sure about is that if the parties to a conflict sense that there are major divisions within the Security Council, particularly major divisions among the P5, they will exploit it. And it makes it very difficult for those on the ground to do the job. If you think of an example of a peacekeeping operation which is generally recognized as having been fairly successful, which is the UN's unprecedented and unfollowed preventive mission in Macedonia, you can begin to see that all these prerequisites were there, and which had a lot to do with the success of the mission in Macedonia. So even though, of course, the UN had difficulties with UNPROFOR in Bosnia and elsewhere, you had a successful mission. There's a political process in place. The mandate was clear, it was credible, it was achievable, very short. Security Council asked the special representative of the Secretary General to use his good offices to help to bring about peace and stability in Macedonia, which was the political mandate. The military part of the mandate had to do with monitoring and reporting developments which could threaten Macedonia's stability. You had adequate material resources and capabilities on the military side. You had a perfect match with about 500 US peacekeepers. Macedonia was the first place where the United States deployed peacekeeping troops in the Balkans, and that was matched by the Nordic troops. So you had the robust message which was being sent by US peacekeepers, and then the long tradition of the Nordics in terms of peacekeeping. And of course, you had political support within the Security Council. I reflect again of Macedonia since President Gligorov just passed away on the 1st of January. And he, of course, demonstrated amongst more than all the leaders of former Yugoslavia at the time, the foresight and the wisdom and the courageous statesmanship to say, I need help, which is also critical if the UN is going to make a difference in terms of peacekeeping, particularly in a preventive manner. And Gligorov had the confidence enough to recognize that he needed help, and so requested the deployment of US peacekeepers. The political will, of course, is critical because what brought about the premature termination of this successful experiment in peacekeeping? Well, once China decided, in response to the government at the time, which had established diplomatic relations with Taiwan, once China decided that this was contrary to its own interests and its foreign policy, then, of course, the mission was terminated in February of 1999. So these prerequisites, I think, are absolutely sound. Let me turn now to the second question, which is the challenges, both quantitative and qualitative, facing UN peacekeeping. I think in a quantitative sense, the numbers, of course, speak for themselves. In 1997, the United Nations had less than 13,000 troops in the field. Today, there are 15 peacekeeping operations with nearly 100,000 uniformed personnel deployed from 115 different countries. You have 5,500 international civilians in UN peacekeeping and about 13,000 national civilians. And only the United States has more personnel, military personnel, deployed worldwide. So it's this huge change. And peacekeepers are serving in the most difficult places in the world. So if you also look at the budget, one sees the huge change. The annual budget for UN peacekeeping has increased from approximately $1 billion in 1997 to about 7.1 billion today. Huge, but it is still a real bargain in relative terms. The United States is supposed to pay about 26% of the peacekeeping budget. And of course, the study of the General Accounting Office in Washington, there's a study a few years ago which concluded that UN peacekeeping is 8 times less expensive than funding a US force, which is very compelling, and particularly in an environment of financial and budgetary constraints. So with this quantitative change, the Brahimi report, which Kofi Annan had actually brought about as Secretary General, which was in 2000, had envisaged equipping DPKO, the Department of Peacekeeping Operations, with capabilities to launch one new multidisciplinary mission per year. So when Brahimi reported, he said, look, DPKO has to have the capacity to launch this one multidisciplinary mission a year. And you're sitting there in the UN, in the SG's office, and the last 2 years of Anand's term as Secretary General, we had to start up and expand 9 field missions, which was 3 per year. So Brahimi was saying, you have to have the capacity to launch 1 mission a year. Last 2 years, we had to launch 9 field missions, 3 per year. Didn't even have the capacity to do 1. And of course, the member states have this appetite to pile things on the UN without, as I was saying, coming up with the adequate resources to match. And of course, a Secretary General can propose, but of course it's the member states who dispose. And even though Brahimi came very close in that report to saying that a Secretary General should say if these requirements and preconditions which I had been mentioning are not met, to say no to the Council. But it would take a very brave Secretary General to be able to do that. The costs of this surge, this quantitative change in peacekeeping, has come with a cost. The first huge cost is that when you have a surge in peacekeeping and you have a growing and challenging demand, what happens is that you do not have, certainly the senior management in DPKO and elsewhere does not have the time to give the required attention which is needed, particularly in terms of reflection and review of strategy, of policy, of effective public communications, because it always comes at a cost. And you also have a situation where some of the missions, even some of the current missions, do not enjoy the full degree of member states' support. The second cost is that when you have the priority to speed up deployment to some missions, you're going to have inadequate support which is going to be given to the ongoing missions. So there's always a trade-off. You have to set up the new missions so the ongoing missions then suffer the cost. And then I think a continuing problem is the shortage of experienced and qualified staff, particularly at the managerial levels. So hopefully the Diplomatic Academy will help to deal with this shortage and this problem. Another point, I think, another cost is the inability to generate the troops and the key enabling capacities when you have too many operations. Peacekeeping is labor intensive. So it's labor intensive, and if it's labor intensive, numbers are important and capabilities are important as well. A good illustration, you may recall, not too long ago, was of course the difficulties that the UN faced with in Darfur, because you didn't have troop contributors who were rushing in to give support to Darfur. And you remember, I'm sure, the saga of the helicopters which were needed in Darfur. And we couldn't even have the helicopters which were needed, which would have made a difference. A related issue is, of course, now in many of the missions, for example in the DRC, you have part of the mandate, the protection of civilians mandate. And if you have the mandate to protect civilians, but you have very limited capacity in terms of troop numbers, in terms of equipment, in terms of intelligence, it is going to be tremendously difficult for the UN to do a credible job. And the final point I would make is that you sometimes have inadequate training of units from the troop contributing countries and shortage of specialized units and personnel. And this is usually felt in three critical areas. One, logistics, second, communications, and third, in terms of engineering. Since the UN does not have its own army, so if Security Council mandates a mission, then of course the Secretary General, with the help of DPKO, then has to go around to cover every single time the force, both the formed units, the civilian police, and of course the international civilian personnel to put it together. And sometimes, as in one of my missions, you would have the spectacle where in the depths of winter you have an engineering company which arrives from a tropical country. We're grateful for it, but in the depths of winter with no winter clothing in the middle of winter. So those are some of the practical challenges that you sometimes have to deal with. Or in another mission where I also served, the helicopter arrives and it has come from a mission in a tropical country. So finally you get the helicopter and you're about to go out because you have to go see some of the troops who are deployed, again in the middle of winter. So the helicopter arrives and you arrive at the airport and the MOVCON, who control these things, say, well, SRSG, there is good news and bad news. The good news is the helicopter has arrived. The bad news is there is no heating. And so you have to fly for an hour. And it's minus 27 degrees. I will always remember that. So you fly for an hour in a helicopter with no heating for minus 27 degrees on the ground. So you can just imagine what it is when you are a few hundred feet above. But those are some of the practical challenges that one has to confront. Because the quantitative challenges, which I have mentioned, are only part of the story. And I think the demands have become qualitatively more complex and will continue to be more complex. In the first generation of the surge, immediately after the Cold War, you had successful peacekeeping operations which were deployed in Namibia, in Cambodia, El Salvador, Mozambique, and they had certain distinguishing features. The first, you had countries, all of those countries had a comprehensive peace settlement in place. I think a second important characteristic, again, in all of those places, the P5 provided united support. Third, the belligerents were limited in number, they were easily identifiable, and they were relatively cohesive. A fourth distinguishing characteristic is that the mandated peacekeeping tasks were relatively limited, and they focused on the transfer of state power. Another important characteristic is that the areas of deployment, whether in Cambodia or El Salvador or Namibia, were relatively limited in size, and finally the international troops deployed were largely self-sustaining. If we look at the current situation and the circumstances now present in the Sudan, in the DRC, in Côte d'Ivoire, in Haiti, we have an infinitely more complex scenario. The first is that the peace agreements that the United Nations is tasked to implement do not enjoy, usually, universal participation and support. For example, when the UN was deployed in the DRC, there was no peace to keep, even though some stakeholders had signed the peace agreement. And similarly, of course, in Darfur, we'd seen that the Darfur peace agreement did not have the broad-based support that people who supported the signature of the agreement expected it would have. So, and you also have pressure to deploy traditional peacekeeping troops where there is no peace to keep in certain parts of the world. And nobody is coming forward to lead or even to contribute multinational forces that would fill the gap. One huge difference. The second, I think, change is that the number of local factions now proliferates rapidly. And so what you have in these environments is a constellation of shifting alliances, uncertain alliances, and then of course lucrative opportunities for economic gain of the illicit kind, usually. You also have now another change where you have strains among the P5. So the honeymoon period immediately after the Cold War has of course been replaced with recent strains exacerbated by tensions. We had of course the tensions over the Iraq War, we had the tensions over the global war on terror, and of course now more recently we have the tensions over Libya and the responsibility to protect. So all of those now have created tensions among P5. I think another change is that, of course, when one looks at the mandates, in contrast to those relatively simple and straightforward mandates, you now have, of course, very complex mandates dealing with the state restoration, complex state restoration, and building processes after decades of conflict. And the operational challenges have also increased, so the areas of deployment are now far more extensive. So classic example, of course, is the DRC. So the DRC, the size of Western Europe. And if you look at the numbers which have been deployed in a country which is the size of Western Europe, you could just imagine the scale of the task. So the typical peacekeeping environment now is remote, it is austere, and you sometimes, of course, find factions which are openly hostile to a UN presence. And in these settings, the lines of communication are subject to frequent disruptions. Local markets for goods, for services are limited or non-existent. The troops, of course, and the staff sometimes lack the local language skills which are necessary to fully interact with the local populations. And then you have insufficient lead time to prepare, to plan, and to deploy. Because one of the huge weaknesses the UN faces, and it will face in the future, is that it has no real rapid deployment capacity. Again, I mentioned, I think one of the reasons for the success in the Macedonian case was because the force deployed relatively rapidly. It usually still takes about 3 months from the time the Security Council mandates a mission until you have all the different components in place. And this lack of a rapid deployment capacity is critical. I said at the outset that Shakespeare always has a way to capture our dilemmas and our problems in a nutshell. And this, if you think of The Merry Wives of Windsor, and Ford says, better 3 hours too soon than a minute too late. So applies perfectly also in peacekeeping. Because if you don't get there in time and you don't get there quickly enough, the political situation changes, the operational environment can change, and it makes it far more difficult to begin to deal with these issues. Before I move on to the third point about sharing political space in peacekeeping and collective conflict management, let me say something about the challenge of governance, which I think is important and has relevance for peacekeeping. Because the UN is facing and will face in the future a major disconnect between those who decide, those who pay, and those who take the risk on the ground. Those who decide and those who authorize peacekeeping missions, of course, we're talking about the Security Council, which has primary responsibility under the Charter for the maintenance of international peace and security. But this is a Security Council which is unreformed and reflects the realities of power, political and economic, of the world of 1945. So this outmoded composition of the Council threatens its legitimacy. And with the threat to the legitimacy of the Council, it has implications for its effectiveness. And I believe that if the Security Council is to be a stronger instrument for collective conflict management, and if it is to increase its ability to garner the widest possible support for its decisions, then it must be more broadly representative of world power and the realities of our times. So we clearly need an expanded, more representative, and thus more legitimate council, which will be appropriate for the 21st century. That's those who decide. Now, those who pay. If we look at those who pay the bills, we talk about the United States, which is about, give or take, 26–27%. The EU as a group, 40%. Japan, 20%. So the United States, the EU, Japan, footing 87% of the bill, and the rest of the world paying 13%. Not a sustainable model, particularly in trying economic and financial times. Now, those who take the risks, those who provide the troops are largely now South Asia, so Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, always in the top numbers of troop contributors, the African countries stepping up, and some Latin American countries, especially in Haiti. So even the traditional supporters of peacekeeping in the 60s and 70s, the neutral countries and the smaller countries, the middle powers, the Nordic countries, Canada, not seen now in terms of commitment of troops and personnel on the ground. This would be quite shocking to Lester Pearson and Dag Hammarskjöld and those who laid the foundations of peacekeeping in the early days. This again is a challenge in the future which the organization needs to confront. We certainly do not want to see a heartache in peacekeeping. It would go quite counter to the whole idea of peacekeeping and having the kind of forces which are put together, certainly in the way that Ralph Bunch and Hammarskjöld and Pearson envisaged it, where you have those who are taking the risks and those who are shedding the blood, essentially from the south, and those who are paying essentially from the north. Because I think it is another critical challenge which the UN will face in the future. Let me now turn to the third and final issue that I wish to touch on, and that is the one regarding sharing political space in conflict management, especially between regional organizations and the United Nations. This is a major challenge. This question raises important issues of legal authority and important questions of political will, and consideration of the optimum roles of regional and international organizations is both timely and necessary. New actors have emerged and old actors are redefining their roles. Since 1990, there have been some 22 cases of subcontracting or regional task sharing by the UN with regional organizations or multinational forces or lead nations in peace operations. This practice has been seen in the Balkans, in Afghanistan, in Haiti, in Timor-Leste, and a wide range of African cases. It can be integrated or joint. It can be coordinated. It can be parallel, and in some cases sequential. There are three, I think there's certain questions really that flow from this challenge related to the UN's role. The first question is, should this outsourcing or subcontracting and hybrid operations be encouraged further? It's a critical question that the UN will face in the future. And a second question, if this phenomenon is here to stay, how can it be improved? My own view is that it is far less problematic to work within the UN Charter than outside of it, and operational efficiency should be a key factor in how peace operations are to be structured. The UN Charter envisaged that the Security Council would have the primary role in the world's peace and security arrangements. It gave the Security Council unique legal authority. It was envisaged that regional organizations had an essential part in the conflict management process, but that these organizations should act within the framework of the UN Charter. The framers of the UN Charter wisely recognized that the original role should be within a wider construct of global order based on universal values. Breaking the nexus between regional operations and global institutions weakens the authority of universal values. And I believe that the special Asian, African, European, or Middle Eastern contribution to the maintenance of global order should not be an exclusive exercise. Rather, it should remain the vanguard within an inclusive global institution. So sharing political space in conflict management is both desirable and achievable. But we have a long way, a very long way to go in consistently applying the optimum operational model for sharing the burden without diluting the effect. The challenges of peacekeeping in the coming years. When it comes to peacekeeping, no other organization can match the UN's legal and moral authority. This authority rests on its charter and its universal and unique legitimacy. In an increasingly globalized world, legitimacy counts for more and more, not only in peacekeeping, but in a wider range of issues. The United Nations is one of the best vehicles for burden sharing and cost sharing, and the need for sharing burdens and sharing costs will only increase in the future. In peacekeeping in particular, the United Nations can be remarkably effective, flexible, and much less costly than alternatives. And no other organization has more experience or more tools for peacekeeping. So, ladies and gentlemen, the United Nations is an indispensable instrument that can be used by the international community for the common good. It offers a unique forum, the organization, for trying to blend power and principle in an era of immense challenges and opportunities. Power in the service of principle, not principle in the service of power. And it is the blend of power and principle, vision and pragmatism that elevates politics into statecraft. Thank you.
Personal experience on being in a tank and having -20 theoretical results outside. it's a unique experience. I had it in my former life as a tank soldier. 20 years ago in Upper Austria, we had a training, and it was at the end of January, and we had minus 23 degrees, and the heating in my tank didn't work. So we had to start at 6 in the morning. The engine worked, and they also had to work, and we ended up in the late afternoon, and it was already getting darker and darker. And when you do not feel the skin in your hair, in your nose, and in your ears, and everywhere, it's a very unique experience. So I can imagine what the pilots and the people in the helicopter have to feel. As a researcher, who I am nowadays, I always start with the first question, that is it worth to consider with the topic? And looking to empirical findings, I can say yes, there is some empirical findings that especially UN peacekeeping works, and it is worth to deal with. You mentioned a number of that it is 8 times cheaper than unilateral or multilateral peacekeeping. It's the first time I hear that high number, but there is some evidence that it is much cheaper than the unilateral peacekeeping efforts from single states or state or alliances. So UN is highly cost effective and an efficient tool. So the first question from my side is answered. It makes sense to deal with the future of UN peacekeeping. So the next questions are coming up, and we can say why peacekeeping, why UN peacekeeping, where, who and how. You mentioned already the preconditions and the environment for the current peacekeeping operations and maybe also for the future peacekeeping operations. There will be a strong need for peacekeeping operations. Even if the global incidence of civil wars does not increase, it is reasonable to project growing instabilities in societies unable to absorb shocks and manage crises arising from transitional organized crime, environmental changes, resource scarcity, and economic downturns. If you look at the World Development Report of 2011, you see a note that on repeated and interlinked forms of violence, where it shows that 90% of civil wars in the 21st century occurred in countries that already had civil wars in the previous 30 years. What will it mean for the future? Will we go the same way around? And there will be a strong need for especially UN peacekeeping. You mentioned also the growing importance of protection of civilians and the concept of the principle of responsibility to protect. What will it mean in the future? Maybe a stronger engagement of the international community and international society. Where will peacekeeping take place? Where will it happen? Empirical findings in that context are peacekeeping is very unlikely in conflicts in or near P5 states, in the near abroad. They are not interested, the international community, in the near abroad. And feelings of historical responsibility for former colonies, political alliance ties, and strategic resources have not generally made peacekeeping more likely. Strong determinants of where enforcement missions deploy are the levels of mistrust and the number of factions involved in the fight. Enforcement missions in particular are more likely in less democratic countries and where past agreements have failed to keep peace. And also a decisive element, the higher the number of victims and killed people during a civil war is, the more likely UN peacekeeping is also. So you can look at the map. Where are current conflicts? Where were the civil wars during the last 30 years? And you can get some kind of feeling and a picture of where future peacekeeping operations will take place. Today's reality is that 2/3 of UN peacekeeping is in Africa. And you look at Africa in the future of about 2030 or 40, you know that bad environmental changes and the huge increase of the population will increase the number of problems and risks that are already there. So with us, we do not know whether it will change rapidly or strongly the engagement of UN peacekeeping in Africa. There will be some additional on other places, but I think Africa will be a strong place for UN peacekeeping in the future too. Who will do peacekeeping? UN mainly, single states, coalitions of the willing and maybe able or unable, and that will not change dramatically. The one point that could be considered in that context is, what will it bring when Western states withdraw from Afghanistan within the next 3 years? Will it bring a change in their external engagement? Will they return more to UN peacekeeping? Will they stay on course in multilateral peacekeeping operations outside the EU under the umbrella of UN, but not as an UN mission? That is a question that will be open for the future and can have a huge impact on future UN peacekeeping operations. One another point in that context is, will there be more place for private military and security companies? We heard already the problems of being able to act rapidly, to react rapidly, or to act rapidly, or to prevent rapidly. We know there is a strong delay, especially in UN engagement. And there are some considerations in the context to engage or to rely a little bit on private military and security companies. Are they the future enablers? Are they the bridges for UN peacekeeping operations? That could be a question that is worth to be considered or more discussed in details. And how will it be? How will UN peacekeeping look like in the future? Interoperability is one of the highest recommendation and prerequisite for UN peacekeeping operations. You mentioned the various configurations of cooperation, and we also have the example of AMISOM, the African Union mission in Somalia, where African Union is providing troops, UN is providing and funding logistics package, EU is ensuring the payment of the contingent, and NATO is providing strategic airlift. Is it a picture of the future? Can it be a picture for the future? Also an interesting aspect that could be discussed a little bit more in detail. 3 dominant trends in peacekeeping will persist. That is more or less for sure, as the experts inside and outside UN say. That is the proliferation of actors, the expansion of the agenda, and the growing complexity of conflict dynamics. And Mr. Alan Leroy Anders, Secretary General for Peacekeeping Operations, mentioned already about the characteristics that emerged already. And he said in that context, not only help countries to achieve some measure of reconciliation and national cohesion, but also to reach the first legitimate democratic government is a key element. Peacekeeping must be able to draw on new technologies, especially drones, and peacekeeping will need to show cost effectiveness. And UN especially have to continue efforts to achieve a coherent and integrative approach. So final remarks from my side in that development and look into the future. I see 6 big challenges to UN peacekeeping operations in particular. To achieve a common vision of main stakeholders on the purpose and the aim of an engagement. To overcome or to bridge the dilemma deriving from the 3 peacekeeping principles, concept of the host state, impartiality, non-resort to force except in self-defense, and the prioritized and overwhelming task of protecting civilians. It causes problems. It caused already problems, and it will cause problems in the future too. Third point, to consider or be prepared for mission creep. Mission creep means you start with a certain mandate, with a certain set of tasks, and the environment is changing totally. you are forced to protect people now. It was not in the intention, it wasn't in the mandate for the first. So you have to prepare for that, because people do not accept in a situation of a crisis where they are in danger, when you say, we are not prepared for that, we are not equipped for that. So it has to be considered already in the phase of mandating and setting up a mission to establish and manage partnerships. Some analysts predict already success, especially of the UN, depends on how the UN can leverage its partnership. And partnership can be manifold. Another point is, I mentioned already, to bring back Western states to participate in UN peacekeeping with personnel. It will bring capacities, it would bring qualities, it would be a strong effort on a strategic level, and the big question to me is, will it change after 2014, after the withdrawal from Afghanistan? And finally, to make capability-based approach, as it is mentioned in many UN papers and documents, make it work, make it reality. And the cooperation of civil and military elements is no longer under question. It is a prerequisite and it is unavoidable. It is indispensable for future engagement in UN peacekeeping missions. Thank you so much.
We kicked off the panel because I cannot provide any similar -20-degree helicopter stories.
It's better for you.
even though I visited a couple of UN missions, I've also had my adventures, especially in Guatemala, where I was taken hostage by unknown, well, people in masks, and I had to swallow my invitation because I was, well, actually smart. I swallowed the invitation of the American embassy because I thought this is in any case not advisable to show it. So, anyway.
We can exchange our experience.
I had many adventures in Cyprus, namely violating all the regulations and nobody cared. Anyway, so I would like to make comments on 3 different issues. First, well, the development history you wonderfully depicted. Second, the changing times. And third, you comment on the Charter of the UN. Well, so I'd like to recall the huge difference between, well, the first generation peacekeeping missions, let's say Cyprus, where we found more or less relaxed blue helmets on the so-called beach-keeping mission or sunshine mission, thinking about private houses to be built with the money, observing a buffer zone which would most probably have been respected anyway. So this is the first generation, and the second generation were the huge failures of the UN, and the damage to their reputation stems from the completely helpless UNOSOM-1 troops in Somalia who could not even deliver the humanitarian goods to the remote areas because everything was looted already in the harbor of Mogadishu. So this is the second generation where Chapter 6 missions were deployed to hot civil wars, to actually, well, fully fledged war zones where only a very weak consent was brokered for a couple of weeks, like in Somalia, with the leaders of the guerrilla. And after 3 weeks, of course, the so-called consent, the invitation necessary for Chapter 6 was gone. So we are moving here, and I'd like to focus on the changes the UN made, because the UN underwent a sort of learning process. I mean, we shouldn't be too negative, because what we could observe slowly, and it started with the resolution 688 in Iraq already, was a change of perception and not a change of the charter, because the charter cannot be changed so easily. So mainly there was a change in in the meaning and in the scope of the security concept, and most important, of the concept of sovereignty, the principle of sovereignty. So what we observe today is just a broader understanding of the notion what is considered a threat to international peace and security. So because there was the shift from, well, threat to peace is between states. Today, and starting with the 688 revolution, the threat is inside. The threat comes from inside the country, and the threat are internal reasons. So internal policies are framed as a threat to peace, and this is where it all started. This softened the norm of non-intervention, and at the same time the human rights regime has hardened, so to say. So this shift in the perception of the principle of sovereignty that, well, as you find it in the Agenda for Peace from 1992, where the beautiful sentence is written, well, principle of sovereignty, of course, but the times of absolute sovereignties are over. This was the famous Butos Butos-Gali sentence. So the shift to an understanding that sovereignty is first and foremost a duty, a responsibility to protect when a state is unable or unwilling to provide life-supporting principles and assistance to the people that are expected to request outside help and accept the help of outsiders. So, should state obstruct this, there is an international responsibility to act. And the state is the principal provider of security. So then sovereignty may also be temporarily suspended. So in my understanding, this led to an ongoing reformulation of the UN peacekeeping role to meet the new peace enforcement demands, and these are increasing demands for intervention in internal wars with high civilian casualties, human rights violation and war crimes. Because every mission has to match the war scenarios, and these scenarios have changed. Let me add for a minute this, the essence of the change. There has been a change of warfare. Cyprus may be described as a, please don't misunderstand it, but as a relatively organized conflict. There was a state army, the Turkish army, occupying 40% of Cyprus. Actually, they wanted to take 30%, but the other Greek Cypriot army was so weak, so they took 40% in order to have some, space for negotiation. Anyway, but it was an organized conflict. No non-state actors, no guerrilla warfare, a buffer zone running through the country. These conflict scenarios are not to be found anymore. So what we see today and observe are that sub-state actors fight each other, that the distinction, the crucial distinction between combatants and non-combatants is blurred or, has actually vanished. So there is no respect for the code of war. And neither is there a respect for the UN troops as such. We observed so many violations and so many attacks on UN troops because there is no respect. There is a kind of regression to the state of nature also observed in the warriors. And the warriors are no combatants, but I mean they can be labeled as civilians actually, because they do not stick to the code of war. They are not organized, they do not wear uniforms, they do not have clear command structures. So the argument here is that actually international law is not able to cover these conflicts anymore, and that changes should also be made in international law, which actually goes hand in hand with the UN reforms.
And you detailed them very, very well, and yet you managed by the end to be fairly optimistic. And my question is really, some of the factors you pointed to, are they likely to change to the better in the future? I'm thinking, for instance, of the lack of resources. With the financial fiscal crisis that is spreading, will states be willing in the future to contribute? We know, for instance, that already member states owe almost $4 billion in unpaid peacekeeping duties. Is it likely to be a turn to better? The budget, I mean, it's impressive, the $7 billion budget, but some have referred to it as a shoestring budget when you compare it to the tasks ahead. It represents less than half of 1% of world military expenditures, for instance. And UN peacekeepers often complain that the UN has yet to come into the 1990s in its technology. So I mean, what do you see? Or can you see any turn to the better on that in that specific field? And the other is, of course, the Security Council. The Security Council has been very resistant to any reform, and the UN Under Secretary General Alain Leroy, who left office some time ago, he made an interview where he said, and I quote, "In crises of great strategic importance, NATO and the US go. For all other kinds of crises, they're happy to have UN peacekeepers go, and then we're scapegoated because we cannot protect 100% of civilians." So I'm turning it to the pessimistic side, but I'd like to hear where you see sort of signs of change to the better in all the problematic areas that you so well pointed out.
I guess no one who gets into this business and this kind of work will do it if you're not fundamentally an optimist. I think you'll have to be, and I plead guilty to the charge. But I think really you have to, at least if you look at the evolution of peacekeeping and you look at the role of the UN, you know, there's a combination, as I said at the end, of realism and also optimism, and you need to balance both. You're right, I think one of the huge challenges, particularly in a constrained financial economic situation, is this model, which I mentioned, where you have a limited number of countries who are footing the bills. So as I said, that's an unsustainable model. So clearly, what I was implicitly suggesting is that other nations, who are not exactly poor, and we can just scan around if you think of some of the Gulf states, there are other states who are quite wealthy and have resources, I believe have to shoulder a greater share of the financial burden for peacekeeping and also for the UN's work generally, rather than just saying there is a formula where we have assessments and we're going to stick by it. In very much the same way that I believe that countries in the north, including Nordic countries, other Western countries, have to begin to put troops on the ground. So similarly, this model has to change. So I think you're right on that score. Just to respond to the central point, which I think the professor made about sovereignty, I think it's really extraordinary, you're absolutely right, to see the change in the attitude towards sovereignty within the UN in the past 10 years. Of course, I always used to think when I would walk into the UN complex, symbolically you have all those flags which are fluttering in front of the UN complex on Turtle Bay, which are graphic representations of the principle of sovereignty and the importance of states who remain important actors in international affairs. And then you have the Secretariat. And then at the back of it, you have in the UN garden, which is not as visible as those flags, you have the eternal flame in the Eleanor Roosevelt garden to the Universal Declaration. So it's a symbolic representation of where the Secretariat, the UN stands always between the flags of the member state sovereignty and that garden at the back to Eleanor Roosevelt. But in the last 10 years, we now have, remarkably, this view that sovereignty has never meant and should not mean a shield behind which sovereigns can massacre and kill their own people. And which, of course, and the important development with the responsibility to protect in 2005, which was adopted by all the world heads of state and government at the World Summit. I think one of the reasons, actually, why we were able to get an acceptance of the responsibility to protect is precisely because it recognizes that the primary responsibility to protect citizens rests with the government. But it's only, of course, if a government is unable or unwilling to protect its own citizens, or if itself is a party to those crimes, that the international community has a responsibility to protect. But I think it's an extraordinary development, an extraordinary change. And in 10 short years from the time that we had the ICISS Commission, its report, and its invocation in the case of Libya last year is quite remarkable. Brigadier General made a number of points. I agree with many of the points you mentioned. I just touch on two. One, on the importance of partnerships. I think in the last 10 years, the UN has learned and is learning that it cannot do everything on its own, and certainly including in peacekeeping. And it has to work with others. So building partnerships with civil society, building partnerships with the private sector, which used to be taboo, and working with global constituencies beyond member states. But it's certainly in the area of peacekeeping, as in other areas, it's humanitarian work and development, the member states have to enhance its capacity for partnerships. On the point on the role of private military and security companies, I was pleased that you posed it as a question and not as a point with which you agreed, because here it's something which I do not think would be in the best interests of international collective conflict management, even recognizing the tremendous challenges that face governments in monitoring peacekeeping operations and collective management both at the regional and international level. My central concern is the lack of accountability that you have with private military and security companies. That's my essential concern. At least you have the accountability, political, which the Security Council provides, however difficult. You have the legitimacy, which the organization provides. And with private military and security companies, you wouldn't have it. So let me just stop.